The infinite has always stirred the emotions of mankind more deeply than any other question. The infinite has stimulated and fertilized reason as few other ideas have, but also the infinite, more than any other notion, is in need of clarification.
Those are the words of the German mathematician David Hilbert. They're from a famous address that he gave in 1925 on the nature of the infinite. And he was right. Ever since people have been able to reflect, they've been captivated and puzzled by the infinite in its many varied guises, by the endlessness of space and time, by the thought that between any 2 points in space, however close, there's always another, by the fact that numbers go on forever, and by the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful God. People have been by turns attracted, fascinated, perplexed, and disturbed by these various different forms of infinity. Our story begins in the 6th century BC with the Greek mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras. Now, it's often said that the ancient Greeks abhorred the infinite. They couldn't make sense of it, they were repelled by it, they would have liked to ignore it altogether. There's some justice to this claim, as we see straight away with Pythagoras. He and his fellow Pythagoreans, as the members of his religious society came to be known, believed in 2 fundamental cosmic principles, one of which they called peras, which can be translated as the limited or the finite, and the other of which they called apeiron, which can be translated as the unlimited or the infinite. And they recognized 2 tables of opposites, each of which was headed by one of these principles. Under the finite, they included whatever is good. Under the infinite, whatever is bad. They also, I'm sorry to say, included under the finite whatever is male, and under the infinite whatever is female. Aristotle, writing more than 100 years later, summed up their view as follows.
Members of the Pythagorean school say that there are 10 first principles, which they arrange in 2 parallel columns thus: limited and unlimited, odd and even, one and plurality, right and left, male and female, resting and moving, straight and crooked, light and darkness, good and bad, square and oblong.
So the Pythagoreans recognized a kind of cosmic battle between the finite and the infinite, between the forces of good and the forces of bad. And they thought that the forces of good prevailed. They looked at the world around them and thought that they saw various examples of the finite in control of the infinite. In particular, they were struck by how much could be understood in terms of the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., the numbers that we use to count finite collections of objects. Structures based on simple relations between these numbers had a beauty and a harmony that other structures lacked, as Professor Richard Sorabji, Honorary Fellow of Wolfson College, Oxford, explains.
The great discovery of Pythagoras is supposed to have been that he realized that on a stringed instrument, the pairs of notes which to our ears sound most pleasing, the consonant notes as they're called, are obtained by taking 2 different string lengths, and the ratios of the string lengths were very, very simple ratios like 2 to 3, 1 to 4, and so on. Whereas with the dissonant notes, which are less pleasing to the untrained ear, the string length ratios had big numbers, 347 to 95. I invented that pair. So this was a great discovery.
But there was a problem for the Pythagoreans. They eventually discovered that not everything can be adequately understood in terms of the counting numbers. Suppose you've got a square whose sides are each 5 centimetres long. How long will the diagonal of the square be? Using Pythagoras' own famous theorem, we can work out that it must be a little over 7 centimetres. What this means is that the ratio 7 to 5 is a good approximation of the ratio of the diagonal to each side. Nevertheless, it's not exactly right. Taking bigger and bigger squares, you can get better and better approximations. But that's all they ever are, mere approximations. The ratio is not that of any two counting numbers, however big. This is what the Pythagoreans themselves discovered, and they were devastated. According to legend, one of them was shipwrecked at sea for revealing this discovery to their enemies, a kind of cosmic retribution. But did all ancient Greek thinkers have this same resistance to the infinite? No. Here's Richard Sorabji again, this time talking about the early 5th century thinker Anaxagoras.
Anaxagoras wanted to explain how things get mixed up. They get terribly mixed up when we eat them, for example. Our flesh and bones are made of all the honey and beans that we eat, for example. Now, how do the honey and beans get mixed up with flesh? Answer. Well, there's something of everything in everything. So in a bit of flesh, you've got some pure honey and pure bean. Not actually quite pure, because if you take one of these tiny little bits of honey or bean that's inside my flesh, inside that tiny little bit of honey or bean are the bits of flesh. Not actually pure flesh, because inside that tiny little bit of flesh there are even tinier bits of honey and bean. And this goes on for infinity.
Here we have the crucial idea of infinite divisibility, the idea that things can be divided up into smaller and smaller parts without limit. Anaxagoras was comfortable with this idea. But in fact, even this idea aroused suspicion among other ancient Greek thinkers. Zeno of Elea, who lived in the 5th century BC, is famous for having discovered various paradoxes associated with infinite divisibility. As soon as we start trying to make sense of infinite divisibility, Zeno argued, we get into trouble. We find that motion itself comes to appear impossible.
We're told by a great later thinker, Aristotle, that Zeno produced 4 paradoxes to show there was no motion, and probably the most arresting and clear one to describe is the paradox of the half-distances. He said, if you think we can move at all, well then, to get anywhere, even to get as far as the door, you would first have to go the first half-distance, and then half of that again, and half of that again. So you'd have to finish crossing an infinite number of distances, half-distances, that is, and that's impossible.
It's impossible, Zeno said, because it's impossible to do infinitely many things in a finite amount of time. There's a closely associated paradox known as the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. This is explained by Ursula Koop, Professor of Ancient Philosophy at Oxford University.
So the Achilles and the tortoise paradox is an argument for something that seems obviously false, right? So the argument is, suppose that a tortoise starts off on a race and then a bit later Achilles starts off. Now, the tortoise goes very slowly, so you'd think Achilles would surely very soon overtake him. So when Achilles starts off, let's say the tortoise is already 100 metres ahead. Well, it's going to take Achilles a certain amount of time to get to the 100-metre mark where the tortoise was when he set off. In that time, the tortoise moves forward a bit. Let's say he moves forward only 2 metres because the tortoise is quite slow. So Achilles has gone forward 100 metres, the tortoise has gone forward 2 metres. So far Achilles hasn't caught up the tortoise. So now Achilles goes forward to where the tortoise now is, 2 metres ahead. But of course, by the time Achilles gets there, the tortoise will have gone forward a little bit further. Only a little bit further, of course, but a little bit further all the same. So Achilles still hasn't caught up with the tortoise. Now Achilles goes forward to where the tortoise now is. But by then, the tortoise would already have gone a little bit further. So Achilles never manages to catch up with the tortoise. He's always just that little bit behind him. That's the argument.
We have a puzzle then. There's a straightforward discrepancy between what observation seems to tell us and what reflection seems to tell us. Observation seems to tell us that things move from one place to another, and that some move faster than others, and that the faster ones sometimes overtake the slower ones. Reflection seems to tell us that none of this is possible. Most of us react to this discrepancy by distrusting reflection. Zeno's own reaction was the opposite. He distrusted observation. He was prepared to draw a very counterintuitive conclusion from his paradoxes. Richard Sorabji explains.
Zeno himself was persuaded to think they showed there is no motion nor change of any kind whatever. I hesitate to put that by saying motion then must have been an illusion in his mind, because even illusions would involve changes in one's mind. So I suppose he actually was persuaded by his teacher that he couldn't believe any of the ordinary things that we all believe.
Zeno's teacher was Parmenides. Parmenides held that reality is an utterly simple unity, and that all those ordinary things that we think, about individual entities making up a complex world and moving around from one place to another, those are all based on illusions. In other words, he believed in a fundamental dichotomy between how things appear and how they really are. So when Zeno was led by his paradoxes to deny that there really is any such thing as motion, in other words, that there is only the appearance of motion, he was defending his master's view. He too was denying that reality has the complexity that it appears to have. If it did, it would have to have infinite complexity, and that, for Zeno, spelled trouble. So the old adage that the ancient Greeks abhorred the infinite does have some truth to it. The infinite confused them, and it troubled them. And the more they reflected on it, the more it confused them, and the more it troubled them. On the other hand, they couldn't simply ignore it. The Pythagoreans couldn't ignore it because they had the diagonal of the square to contend with. Zeno couldn't ignore it because he had motion to contend with, or at least the appearance of motion. We shall see in the next programme how Aristotle rose to the challenge that they had confronted. Our story began with the early Greeks recoiling from the infinite and trying to turn their backs on it. In this programme, we'll see how Aristotle, who was himself one of the giants of ancient Greek philosophy, sought a rapprochement. Aristotle lived in the 3rd century BC. He studied in the school of philosophy that had been established just 2 years before he was born by that other great thinker, Plato. This was a school designed to improve the character of those in public life. It was situated in a grove of trees near to Athens, in a plot of land that had belonged to the Attic hero Academos, and it was here that Academos was also said to have been buried. As a result, the school was referred to as the Academy. From this we get both the modern word academy, and also, because of the school's location, the phrase the groves of academia. This school survived for some 900 years, a feat yet to be matched by the universities of either Oxford or Cambridge. The story goes that Plato placed an inscription over its door, on which were written the following words:
"Let no one enter here who is ignorant of geometry."
If the story is true, this gave wonderful expression to Plato's veneration of mathematics. At any rate, Aristotle passed the test. He had a keen interest in mathematics, and this in turn guided his work on the infinite. Early Greek thinkers were troubled by the infinite. It was a source of perplexity, paradox, and puzzlement. In various ways they tried to repudiate it, or simply to ignore it. But they found that they couldn't do either. Aristotle tried to find a way out of this quandary. He said that there is one kind of infinity that really is to be repudiated, but another that is a fundamental feature of reality. In one sense, the infinite does not exist. In another, it does. All we need to do, Aristotle said, is to distinguish between these different senses.
It is plain that there is no body which is actually infinite. But on the other hand, to suppose that the infinite does not exist in any way leads obviously to many impossible consequences. There will be an end of time. A magnitude will not be divisible into magnitudes. Number will not be infinite. If, then, neither alternative seems possible, an arbiter must be called in. And clearly, there is a sense in which the infinite exists and another in which it does not.
Aristotle introduced labels for his distinction. He talked about the potential infinite and the actual infinite. It was the potential infinite that he acknowledged and the actual infinite that he denied. But how was the distinction to be understood? John Barrow, Professor of Mathematical Sciences at Cambridge University, explains.
Aristotle made this rather profound but straightforward distinction between two types of infinity, the potential infinity and the actual. The potential, which he was happy about, is the one that you never reach, that never bites you, as it were. It's like counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and so on forever. We know that there is no limit to your counting, but you never get there. What Aristotle didn't like was an actual infinity, so something that you achieve, something that could happen in your laboratory or in the world around us.
Another way to think of it is in temporal terms. A potential infinity is an infinity that's spread over time. An actual infinity is an infinity that's there all at once. Imagine a clock endlessly ticking. The ticking is potentially infinite. It never reaches completion. On the other hand, if there were an infinitely big object, or an infinite stockpile of objects, that would be an actual infinity. The infinity would be there all at once. Aristotle thought that there was something problematical about an infinity that's there all at once, but he didn't think that there was anything problematical about an infinity that's spread over time. And he didn't think that we ever needed to acknowledge anything more than that. Yes, objects are infinitely divisible. But that just means that the process of dividing a given object will never end. And yes, the sequence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., is infinite. But that just means that the process of counting will never end. One consequence of Aristotle's view is that, although time itself is infinite, space can't be. Space can't be infinite because it's there all at once, so it must be finite. Yet that seems puzzling to us, for we naturally think that if space is finite, then it must be limited, and if limited, then limited by something. But surely that something must be just further space, which in turn must be either infinite or else limited by yet further space, and so on. To put it crudely, if space is finite, what's outside space? Here's Ursula Koop, Professor of Ancient Philosophy at Oxford University.
So Aristotle does raise that as a puzzle. And his answer is that it's just wrong to think that anything limited has to be limited by something. So something can have its own limits. So the thought is that if you take just ordinary finite things like us, it's not the case that if you took our surroundings away, we would just expand infinitely. We have our own limits, which are fixed by the fact that we're human beings, and human beings are of a certain kind of size. So similarly, the cosmos as a whole has limits of its own.
We'll see later in the series how the idea that space can be both finite and yet have nothing further outside it has survived into contemporary physics. But let's go back to this basic distinction between the potential infinite and the actual infinite, along with Aristotle's acceptance of the one and his rejection of the other. Wasn't he, in effect, just trying to have his cake and eat it? For instance, Aristotle agreed that however far you count along the sequence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., you can always count further. But why? Unless those bigger numbers are in some sense already there. But if these bigger numbers are already there, doesn't this mean that there's an actual infinity after all? Here's Ursula Coupe again.
It depends on his view of what numbers are. So Aristotle's view is that for there to be a number, there has to in fact be a collection of things of the magnitude of that number. So for the number 2 to be, there have to be 2 things. For the number 3 to be, there have to be 3 things, and so on.
For you to be able to count up to 1 million, then, what's required is not that the number 1 million should somehow already be there, but just that you should be able to find 1 million things to count. How does this help, though? Doesn't it still follow that you can't count indefinitely unless there's an actual infinity? For doesn't there have to be an inexhaustible supply of things for you to count? No, says Aristotle. All that's required is that you should be able to keep dividing something into smaller and smaller parts. As long as you can keep doing that, then you will always have more and more things to count. But how does this help? For you can't keep dividing something into smaller and smaller parts, can you? Unless those smaller and smaller parts are already there. It still looks as though you can't count indefinitely unless there's an actual infinity.
But Aristotle doesn't think of it in that way. He thinks that if you have a perfectly uniform line and you divide it into 2 parts, you're actually creating those 2 parts. He's not committed to thinking there are already infinitely many parts. You're actually creating the parts as you make the division.
Aha, that's clever. In fact, it's doubly clever, for it not only enables Aristotle to evade the worry that the potential infinite requires an actual infinite, it also enables him to solve the famous paradoxes of Zeno, which seem to show that you can't move without performing infinitely many tasks in a finite time. That's to say, without doing the impossible. Ursula Coupe again.
Zeno says in order to move a set distance, say a mile, you first have to have moved through half a mile, and before you can move through half a mile, you first have to have moved through a quarter of a mile, and before you can move through a quarter of a mile, you first have to have moved through eighth of a mile, and so on, so that you'd have to have done infinitely many movements in order to do this one movement of moving a mile, and that seems to him to be impossible.
But Aristotle thinks that he's solved this problem, because he thinks that no journey is actually divided into infinitely many smaller journeys. He thinks a journey is divided only where someone actually does something to divide it. For instance, stopping to open or close an umbrella. Here's Ursula Coupe again, with a summary of what Aristotle would say in response to Zeno.
Just because you can divide the movement anywhere and can divide it more and more places if you want to, it doesn't mean that it is in fact divided anywhere and that it has infinitely many parts. It's just not true that in going a mile you have to do infinitely many sub-movements, because unless the parts are in some sense marked out, they aren't there.
So I can travel a mile in a finite amount of time. If my home is a mile away from where I work, I can get home tonight. Let's see. I can get halfway there. Oh, damn, it's raining. I can get 3/4 of the way there. Oh, it's stopped. I can get 7/8 of the way there. Oh, it's started up again. See, every time I stop to open or close my umbrella, I make a division in my journey. All these divisions can be made, and if they are, I can pass them. But however many are made, it will only ever be a finite number. However, not everyone finds Aristotle's approach convincing. Here is Professor Richard Sorabji, Honorary Fellow of Wolfson College, Oxford.
His idea was, well, I can get home tonight. I can do this because however large a finite number of half-distances I've travelled, I can travel a larger number, finite number of half-distances, so I can get as close to home as I like. Hey, wait a moment. I don't want to get as close to home as I like. I don't like that. I want to get all the way home. How's that done, Mr. Aristotle?
Aristotle's views haven't gone totally unchallenged then. Even so, for over 2,000 years, this basic idea of Aristotle's, that the only sense in which something can be infinite is the sense in which a never-ending process is infinite, was more or less orthodoxy. And many people still think that it was fundamentally correct. The first 2 programs in this series transported us back to the world of the ancient Greeks. This program brings us forward many hundreds of years to the world of medieval and Renaissance philosophy. The Greeks still have an important role to play, though. For there were 2 things that dominated philosophy in general throughout this time, and philosophical thought about the infinite in particular. One of these was the legacy of the Greeks, above all, the legacy of Aristotle. The other was religion, above all, Christianity. But the combination was in many ways an unstable and volatile one. The hostility that the Greeks had felt towards the infinite sat uncomfortably with the more infinity-friendly worldview of the new religious order. Attempts were made to integrate the two, above all by St. Thomas Aquinas. But the effects, as we shall see, were sometimes violent. One of the first indications of the tension that would be felt came in the work of Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century AD, right at the end of antiquity. Plotinus was born in Upper Egypt and was thoroughly immersed in the Greek culture of Alexandria. He tried to breathe new life into various ancient Greek ideas, but he tried to do so in the context of his own belief in God. And he declared that God was infinite. Indeed, he declared that God was the infinite. This was a significant moment in the history of the infinite. No one before had said anything quite like that. It was also a direct assault on the Greeks' denigration of the infinite. No longer would there be, as there had been among the Greeks, a tendency to hear the word infinite as a derogatory term. From now on, quite the opposite. The tension was to be felt particularly severely in the confrontation between the teachings of Aristotle and Christianity. Aristotle had insisted that nothing could be infinite, at least not if this meant that its infinity was somehow present all at once. Nothing could be infinitely big, or consist of infinitely many parts, or have an infinitely complex structure. In his own terms, nothing could be actually infinite. The most that he had been prepared to countenance, again in his own terms, was that which is potentially infinite. He had in mind processes like the revolution of the heavens that are destined to go on and on forever. Processes whose infinity is, so to speak, perpetually deferred. But Christianity fostered a belief in and a veneration of that which is infinite in a much deeper sense than this. The teachings of Aristotle in Christianity were in conflict then. Even so, there was an attempt to marry them. It was the great 13th century Italian theologian St. Thomas Aquinas who was the single most important figure here. Before we turn to Aquinas' work, let's hear something of his background. As a youngster, Aquinas became attracted to the life of spiritual service that he found among religious orders such as the Dominicans, which contrasted with the more sheltered lifestyle of the Benedictines, to which his family had previously exposed him. Here is Professor Cecilia Trifoli, lecturer in medieval philosophy at Oxford University.
Aquinas is maybe the most famous Aristotelian philosopher of the Middle Ages, and he became a Dominican friar at quite an early stage of his career, as a teenager. This was much against the will of his mother, because Aquinas came from a very rich family, and it was considered more appropriate for him, as coming from a rich family, to join the Benedictine order. This was against Aquinas' will, so Aquinas decided to join instead the Dominican order, and he made a sort of great career in that order.
Not that Aquinas' eagerness to belong to the Dominican order and his mother's attempts to prevent him were just a minor domestic tiff. She locked him in the family castle for more than a year. But still, Aquinas went on to become a great theological and philosophical authority, perhaps third only to Jesus Christ and St. Paul in the extent to which he shaped subsequent Catholicism. Aquinas believed that God was infinite, but he also wanted to accept as much as possible of Aristotle's teaching. And this, as we've seen, posed a problem. It looked as if Aquinas' belief in God's infinitude ran directly counter to Aristotle's teaching. It looked as if it committed him to an infinity that was more than just the potential infinity of some never-ending process. Here is Cecilia Trifoli again, explaining Aquinas' need for a reconciliation and how he tried to find it.
Aquinas needs to make space for the notion of an infinite God. The question is whether Aristotle can provide the adequate framework, philosophical framework, to shape a notion of divine infinity. Now, Aquinas is skeptical about that. He does accept the major thesis of Aristotle about the infinite. For example, there is no actually infinite magnitudes. There is not an actually infinite numbers. But he also thinks that the notion of infinite that applied to the quantitative case has nothing to do with the notion of infinite that should be applied to the divine case.
What Aquinas did then, as Cecilia Trifoli has indicated, was to invoke a new contrast between what we might call a mathematical or quantitative understanding of the infinite and a metaphysical or theological understanding of the infinite. The mathematical understanding has to do with size, measurement, and number. The metaphysical understanding has to do with absoluteness and perfection. Aquinas thought that Aristotle's teaching only really concerned the infinite understood in a mathematical way. Aquinas therefore had no qualms about holding that God was infinite in a metaphysical sense, all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful. He took this to be, as it were, outside Aristotle's jurisdiction. So Aquinas felt that he had done as much justice as he could, both to his Christianity and to his Aristotelianism. His metaphysical understanding of the infinite helped to underpin his Christianity. His mathematical understanding of the infinite was essentially Aristotle's. Aquinas' views went on to dominate subsequent medieval thought. Aristotle became the ultimate philosophical authority in all matters of Christian doctrine. Christianity and Aristotelianism were now wedded. But, as you might expect, given what we've already witnessed, their marriage was in many ways an unhappy one. Later Christian thinkers continued to take issue with Aristotle, though by now, of course, they were taking issue with the Catholic Church too. Towards the end of the 16th century, the Italian philosopher and mathematician Giordano Bruno declared that God's creation was an expression of his infinite grandeur and was therefore itself infinitely rich and infinitely diverse. Because Aristotle had repudiated any infinity that's present all at once, he had held that the universe is spatially finite and that there can never be more than finitely many things of any given kind. Bruno dissented on both counts. He held that the universe is spatially infinite and that it is occupied by infinitely many worlds. This naturally incited the wrath of the Church. Mocenigo, a wealthy Venetian, persuaded Bruno to come to Venice and teach him
the art of memory and invention.
But Mocenigo was working closely with the ecclesiastical authorities and turned Bruno into the Inquisition. Bruno was imprisoned, and for 9 years he was interrogated and tortured. He refused to recant, however. Eventually, in 1600, he was burnt at the stake, an event that is often regarded as the end of the Renaissance. Bruno's near contemporary Galileo only narrowly escaped the same fate. He too angered the Church, most famously by articulating reasons for thinking that the sun, not the earth, is at the centre of the universe. But he also, like Bruno, departed from the prevailing Catholic orthodoxy by opposing Aristotle on the infinite. Where Aristotle had denied that there could be an infinite totality existing as a completed whole, Galileo believed that the totality of counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc., was just that. Galileo was well aware of the paradoxes that this involved. Indeed, he fastened on a new paradox of his own. Each square number, Galileo argued, can be paired with its own root. 1 can be paired with itself, 4 can be paired with 2, 9 can be paired with 3, etc. This seems to show that there are as many squares as numbers altogether, even though it seems obvious that there are fewer.
If I should ask how many squares there are, one might reply truly that there are as many as the corresponding number of roots, since every square has its own root and every root has its own square, while no square has more than one root and no root more than one square. But if I inquire how many roots there are, it cannot be denied that there are as many as there are numbers, because every number is the root of some square. Yet it seems there are many more numbers than squares, since the larger portion of them are not squares.
Galileo was nevertheless unfazed. He simply concluded that we mustn't try to think about the infinite using our normal finite categories.
So far as I can see, we can only infer that the totality of all numbers is infinite, that the number of squares is infinite, and that the number of their roots is infinite, and the attributes equal, greater, and less are not applicable to infinite, but only to finite quantities.
Whether Galileo's reaction is correct or not, here is our first glimpse of a whole new family of paradoxes, rivaling in importance any that the Greeks had considered. Later, we shall see how these paradoxes informed mathematical work on the infinite and issued in fresh insights into its nature. Meanwhile, as we reflect back on this 1500-year period, a number of things stand out. The gradual consolidation by Aquinas and others of the metaphysical or theological conception of the infinite, the undiminished influence of Aristotle's more mathematical conception, the uneasy relationship between these, and the consequent ongoing struggle to know quite what sense to make of it all. Our story now reaches the 17th and 18th centuries. This was the Age of Enlightenment in Western Europe. During this period, a spirit of questioning prevailed. Individuals were encouraged to trust their own intellectual resources above tradition and authority. As far as attempts to make sense of the infinite were concerned, this led to a self-conscious concern with what grasp we have, if any, of what we're even talking about. Where the focus up until then had been on the infinite itself, the focus now was on us finite beings and on our understanding of the infinite. Philosophers were much exercised by the fact that we never have direct experience of anything infinite. Does this mean, as some thought, that our understanding of the infinite has some quite different source, or does it mean, as others thought, that really we don't have any understanding of the infinite at all? That our very talk of the infinite is empty verbiage, and that the struggles of the previous 2.5 millennia to get a firm grip on this concept had been so much wasted effort? In this programme, we shall see reactions of both kinds. We begin with the brilliant French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, who lived in the first half of the 17th century, and who is often said to have been the father of modern philosophy. Descartes was an archetypal Enlightenment thinker. He sought a secure foundation for all his beliefs, but he didn't think that the sheer fact that he had been brought up accepting something equipped it for this role. So he called into question everything that he had previously taken for granted, to see whether there was anything that he couldn't doubt. And he decided that, at any rate, he couldn't doubt that here he was engaged in this very inquiry. He couldn't doubt his own existence. As he famously said,
Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am.
He then turned his attention to God. He focused on the infinitude of God, which he found he had a propensity to affirm. But should he respect this propensity? Given that none of us ever has direct experience of God's infinitude, given, indeed, that God's infinitude is beyond our very imagining, can we hope to have any sort of insight into it? Descartes was optimistic.
It is possible to know that God is infinite and all-powerful, although our soul, being finite, cannot grasp or conceive him. In the same way, we can touch a mountain with our hands, but we cannot put our arms around it as we could put them around a tree. To grasp something is to embrace it in one's thought. To know something, it is sufficient to touch it with one's thought.
Still, even if this shows that it's possible to know that God is infinite, Descartes still needed to decide whether he did in fact have such knowledge. Where did his idea of an infinite God come from? This question looked as if it might stop Descartes in his tracks. In fact, however, he decided that it did the very opposite. He thought it provided him with an argument for God's existence. For he reckoned that his idea of God was an idea of something so great that only something that great, God himself, could have implanted it in his mind. Here is John Cottingham, Professor Emeritus at Reading University.
He reflects on his nature and immediately is aware that there are many things he can't do, many things he doesn't know. He's finite, he's a limited being. But also inside him, he finds this idea of infinity, of an infinite, an infinitely perfect being. And he reasons that the content of this idea is so great that he can't have constructed it from his own finite resources. So it must have been, as it were, put in his mind by a being who really is infinite, God.
I must consider whether there is anything in my idea of God which could not have originated in myself. By the word God, I understand a substance that is infinite. All the attributes of this substance, such as supreme intelligence and supreme power, are such that the more carefully I concentrate on them, the less possible it seems that the idea I have of them could have originated from me alone. So, it must be concluded that God necessarily exists.
Later in the 17th century and through to the 18th century, a group of British philosophers, commonly known as the empiricists, recoiled. Descartes had said that the sheer fact that we can't grasp the infinite in our imagination doesn't mean that we can't touch it with our thought. But the empiricists thought that it did mean that. It meant that whenever we talk about the infinite, not just in connection with God, we literally have no idea what we're talking about. Suppose, for instance, that someone were to claim that some given physical object is infinitely divisible. For the British empiricists, this would fly in the face of the fact that we can't experience ever smaller physical objects. There is, they insisted, a limit to how small anything can be. One of them, George Berkeley, was more specific. He maintained,
"There is no such thing as the 10,000th part of an inch."
Another, David Hume, defended their view by inviting us to consider the appearance of a spot of ink as we back away from it, the moment before it vanishes. That last moment at which it's visible, he said, represents a definite limit to our power of visual discrimination.
Put a spot of ink upon paper. Fix your eyes upon that spot, and retire to such a distance that at last you lose sight of it. 'Tis plain that the moment before it vanished, the image or impression was perfectly indivisible. 'Tis not for want of rays of light striking our eyes that the minutest parts of distant bodies convey not any sensible impression, but because they are removed beyond that distance at which their impressions were reduced to a minimum, and were incapable of further diminution.
So we have Descartes on the one hand and Berkeley and Hume on the other, taking opposite sides in the debate about whether our sheer inability to encounter the infinite in experience casts doubt on the very notion. Towards the end of the 18th century, the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant tried to arbitrate. He agreed with Descartes that we have a clear idea of the infinite. But he also agreed with the empiricists that our knowledge and understanding are restricted to what we're capable of experiencing. What our idea is, Kant said, is an innate idea that enables us to have thoughts about, perhaps to invest faith in, and even to be guided by what we nevertheless can't know. John Cottingham again.
In a way, he takes the empiricist position as his starting point. Knowledge is confined to the natural world, the world of the five senses. And we can't, he thinks, really go beyond that. Or if we do, we leave the solid ground of truth and knowledge and venture out into a foggy ocean of metaphysical speculation, which won't get us anywhere. It will just lead us to contradictions. And you might think from there that he can't say anything about God or the infinite. But he does. he famously said, I go beyond knowledge, or I abolish knowledge in order to make room for faith.
So Kant thinks that faith can take us into territory into which our knowledge can never take us. It can put us in touch with what we can never hope to see, hear, feel, taste, or smell.
He thinks that there's certain aspects of our human life, the life of the mind, if you like, which do, in a certain sense, put us in touch with the infinite. And the most important of those for Kant is our reason, our rationality, which takes us above, or somehow in some strange way outside the realm of mere biology, of our mere animal nature, and enables us to grasp the moral law. And the moral law is something which gives us, in a certain way, infinite dignity. As rational beings who acknowledge the demands of the moral law, we recognize that each rational being is of infinite worth.
By the moral law, Kant meant the foundation of all morality. He meant what determines the basic difference between right and wrong, what directs us, or what ought to direct us, in all we do. And he believed that the moral law consisted of purely rational principles which demand that we accord one another infinite respect as fellow rational beings, that we never treat one another merely as means to our own ends, but always as infinitely valuable ends in their own right. Kant's vision was a splendid and uplifting one, and the infinite played a wonderful role in that vision. This role didn't concern the world that we experience with our five senses, the world of space and time, magnificent and multifarious though he took that world to be. It concerned something quite different. It concerned the very basis of right thinking and right living. I'll leave you with a famous quotation from Kant, in which he movingly and eloquently summed up his vision, and part of Beethoven's 8th String Quartet, which is said to have been inspired by this very quotation.
Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and the more steadily they are reflected upon: the starry heaven above me, and the moral law within me. The first begins at the place which I occupy in the external world of sense. The second begins at my invisible self, my personality, and depicts me in a world which has true infinity. The first view of a countless multitude of worlds annihilates, as it were, my importance as that of an animal creature, which must give back to the planet, a mere speck in the universe, the matter of which it was formed, after it has been provided for a short time, we know not how, with vital power. The second, on the other hand, infinitely raises my worth as that of an intelligence by my personality, in which the moral law assigns a destination to my existence, a destination which is not restricted to the conditions and limits of this life, but reaches into the infinite.
Today's programme begins with a conversation between 11-year-old Alfie Pryke and Siri on his iPhone.
Hi Siri, what's 0 divided by 0?
Imagine that you have 0 cookies and you split them evenly among 0 friends. How many cookies does each person get? See, it doesn't make sense. And Cookie Monster is sad that there are no cookies, and you are sad that you have no friends.
That nicely anticipates one of the main themes of today's programme. So far in this series, we've been thinking of the infinite mostly in philosophical and theological terms. In this and the next two programmes, we'll be looking at it through the lens of mathematics. We begin with the mathematics of the infinitely small, which, as we shall see, has its own remarkable history. It was in the late 17th century that mathematicians began to develop the branch of mathematics that's crucial here, namely the calculus. The calculus has been of enormous mathematical significance. It's also been of enormous practical utility. Science, business and technology these days would all be quite unthinkable without it. From the design of aircraft to the estimation of how much a tumour will shrink in a given time with effective chemotherapy, the calculus is at work throughout our lives. But what exactly is the calculus? Imagine a train setting off on a journey of exactly 60 miles. And imagine that it takes exactly 1 hour to complete the journey. Then, clearly, its average speed for that journey, the distance it travels divided by the time it takes to travel it, is 60 miles an hour. But this doesn't mean that its speed throughout the entire journey is 60 miles an hour. Over some stretches of the journey, it may average a greater speed. Over others, something slower. For instance, perhaps in the first half hour it makes good progress and gets 2/3 of the way to its destination, while in the second half hour it's delayed by signal failure. Now, suppose that at some particular moment on the journey the train driver glances at the speedometer and sees that it reads 70 miles an hour. What the speedometer is telling the driver is that at that very instant the train is travelling at 70 miles an hour. But what does this mean? It's easy just to take for granted that the train has a particular speed at a particular instant. And yet, where an instant is concerned, as opposed to some definite stretch of the journey, both the distance the train travels and the time it takes to travel it seem to be infinitely small, which, if it means anything at all, seems to mean that they're both in effect zero, which in turn makes it hard to see how the concept of speed can even apply. What is the train's speed if it travels no distance at all, in no time at all? That seems to be like asking, what is 0 divided by 0? The very question that Siri told us doesn't make sense. But then, what is it to be travelling at a particular speed at a particular instant, as opposed to averaging some speed over the course of an entire journey, or during some part of a journey? This is where the calculus comes in. It helps us to answer this question by considering the train's speed over shorter and shorter stretches of the journey that include that moment. Through the investigation of ever briefer periods in the progression of things, it provides precise mathematical tools for studying and describing how things change, while bypassing the various impossible calculations that we would have to perform if we tried to deal directly with what is happening to things at particular moments. Well, let's leave the train there and find out more about the history of the calculus. It's now generally acknowledged that the calculus was invented quite independently by two men. The Englishman Sir Isaac Newton, who was arguably the greatest scientist of all time, and the brilliant German mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. There were bitter disputes both between them and between their disciples about who got there first, about who deserved the greater credit, and even about whether one of them had stolen ideas from the other. It appears that Newton arrived at his discoveries in the 1660s, about 10 years earlier than Leibniz, but he didn't publish until much later. He was content at first to describe his ideas to his friends. Later, he wrote to Leibniz about these ideas. Here's Brian Clegg, a science writer and author of a popular book on infinity, to tell us about Newton's early forays into this new mathematical territory.
He seems to have come up with the basic ideas of calculus really quite early on. although he developed them over a number of years, but kept them a secret, effectively. And over a period of time, he let little smidgens out. In fact, he sent a letter to Leibniz that supposedly explained his method of fluxions, which is his version of calculus, although it was actually effectively in a code, so it wasn't possible to read what it said.
By then, Leibniz seems to have arrived at his own version of the calculus and wrote back to Newton accordingly. But because Leibniz travelled around a great deal and letters took several months to reach him, it was a long while before Newton heard back. When he did eventually hear back, he suspected plagiarism. He was outraged, and he reacted with great hostility towards Leibniz. Leibniz, for his part, was not so much angered as bemused.
He didn't really understand why this attack was being made on him, because it got to the point where one of Newton's supporters, called John Keel, published a paper that effectively said that Leibniz had plagiarized Newton's ideas. But from Newton's viewpoint, he always wanted to be the centre of everything. If anybody challenged him, then he immediately went into defensive mode, and it seems to have lasted, in his case, for decades. Once he got onto a subject, that was it. Leibniz was one of the enemies, and he was going to get attacked.
Eventually, at Leibniz's own prompting, the Royal Society, of which both men were fellows, was asked to adjudicate.
In the end, because Leibniz was a fellow of the Royal Society, he persuaded them that there ought to be an investigation, and a committee was got together to settle the dispute of who came up with the idea first, which seems very fair and sensible. And the report was written up by the president of the Royal Society, which makes you think, this is a very good and fair thing.
At last, it seemed, the matter could be properly resolved. But what was the verdict of this report? Well, it came down firmly against Leibniz. And you might think, given that this report was written by the president of the Royal Society, no less, that this should have been the end of the matter. But no.
The fact is, Newton was the president, he wrote his own report, and I think that's just a typical example, frankly, of the way that he made sure that he got his way.
This was perhaps not Newton's finest hour. Be the dispute between Newton and Leibniz as it may, from its very inception the calculus enjoyed spectacular success, especially in its practical applications. Nevertheless, early work on the calculus didn't always meet the highest standards of rigour. There were texts in which infinitely small quantities appeared in the calculations, playing a role that was completely incoherent. It really was as if we were being invited to adjudge the speed of an object that moves no distance at all in no time at all, just the sort of absurdity that the calculus had been designed to avoid. The Irishman George Berkeley, who, as well as being a philosopher, was the Anglican Bishop of Cloyne, was aggrieved that the very same mathematicians who accepted such illicit methods also objected to various principles of Christianity on grounds of incoherence. He got his own back by mounting a scathing attack on them. Brian Clegg again.
There was a real problem that Berkeley was illustrating, and what that came down to was that in heading towards that value of what is the speed, say, at a particular moment, what you were doing was dividing by a smaller and smaller amount that eventually disappeared away to nothing. And it was that disappearing away to nothing, Berkeley referred to the ghosts of departed quantities, that was the issue. How did you handle that?
To judge by the texts to which Berkeley was taking exception, it was handled by supposing that you could unproblematically divide 0 by 0. But as Siri told us, you can't do that. Let's think again about why not. Consider first what happens when you divide a number, 10 say, by smaller and smaller amounts.
So if you divide 10 by half, that's like multiplying it by 2, so you get 20. If you divide 10 by a quarter, that's like multiplying it by 4, you get 40. And as the bottom half of the fraction gets smaller and smaller, the result gets bigger and bigger. So you end up, as the bottom half gets towards 0, the result comes out towards infinity.
That suggests that 10 divided by 0 is infinity, if such a thing makes any sense. On the other hand, if 0 is on the top half of a fraction, it looks as if the result should be 0. 0 divided by 10 is 0. 0 divided by 20 is 0. But when 0 is both on the top and on the bottom, we get a kind of meltdown. It just has no meaning. Berkeley was quite right to be aggrieved then. He mounted his attack in a famous essay called The Analyst. Analyst was Berkeley's word for someone who practiced what he called the modern analysis, and the modern analysis was just his term for the calculus. But in its full version, the title was much longer than that. It indicated, among other things, that the essay was
addressed to an infidel mathematician.
The mathematician in question was Edmund Halley, discoverer of the comet. Halley was reported to have described the doctrines of Christianity as incomprehensible, and the religion itself as an imposture. The full title of Berkeley's work, which also included a familiar quotation from the Gospels, ran as follows.
The Analyst, or a discourse addressed to an infidel mathematician, wherein it is examined whether the object, principles, and inferences of the modern analysis are more distinctly conceived or more evidently deduced than religious mysteries and points of faith. First cast the beam out of thine own eye, and then thou shalt see clearly to cast the mote out of thy brother's eye.
In the works of Newton and Leibniz themselves, however, there was already plenty to anticipate the precision and rigour that would later be conferred on the calculus by various 19th century practitioners. Precisely what such precision and rigour show is that the calculus can be framed without any reference to infinitely small quantities. There's certainly no need to divide 0 by 0. What then remains is a branch of mathematics which is regarded by many in its beauty, depth and power as one of the greatest ever monuments to mathematical excellence. In the last programme, we were concerned with the infinitely small. Now our attention turns to the infinitely big. Not the infinitely big in the physical world, that will be our focus in a later programme, but the infinitely big in mathematics. We shall explore the work of the brilliant German mathematician Georg Cantor. Cantor devised a way of distinguishing between different infinite sizes and calculating with infinite numbers. No one before had done anything remotely like this. His work was utterly revolutionary. What's the biggest number? Everyone knows that there isn't one. However far you count along the sequence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., you can always count further. Even Aristotle, that arch-skeptic about the infinitely big, accepted this. But this was as much as he accepted. He thought that the infinite existed only in the sense that some processes, like the process of counting, are destined to go on and on forever. And for over 2,000 years his view prevailed. For over 2,000 years there was hostility to the idea that the infinite could be an object of mathematical study in its own right. This orthodoxy was not challenged until the late 19th century, when Cantor entered the scene. Cantor presented a systematic, rigorous, formal theory of the infinite. But what drove him, and at what cost? Cantor was motivated to pursue these ideas by various problems that he'd been working on in the calculus. But he was also deeply religious. He believed that his mathematical abilities were a gift from God, which enabled him to vindicate certain views that he held about God. In particular, in the very process of showing that there's a kind of infinity that can be an object of mathematical study, he found himself drawing a contrast with a kind of infinity that can't be, what he called the absolute. And it was this second kind of infinity that he thought characterized God. Perhaps partly because of its theological overtones, Cantor's work was not universally accepted. A contemporary French mathematician, Henri Poincaré, described it as
a perverse, pathological illness that will one day be cured.
More pertinently, Cantor's own teacher, the German mathematician Leopold Kronecker, the one person who might have been expected to support him, showed lifelong hostility to his work. Kronecker was suspicious of any mathematics that was not ultimately concerned with the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., what he called the integers. He famously said,
God made the integers. All the rest is the work of man.
Kronecker could not accept that there was any legitimate mathematics of the infinite. He became a fierce opponent of Cantor, as Mary Lang, senior lecturer in philosophy at York University, explains.
Kronecker, I think, thought, well, we can't really make sense of these things. There's really nothing meaningful about this mathematics at all. And so he just rejected Cantor's views of on the infinite completely and did his best to try and stop it from being published or from really taking hold in the world of mathematics.
This opposition took its toll on Cantor, no doubt exacerbated by some painful bereavements that he suffered, and, who knows, perhaps also exacerbated by the sheer perplexity of his own work. Cantor had a series of nervous breakdowns. He died in an asylum. But posterity has been kinder to Cantor than his contemporaries. The work that he produced gave rise to an important branch of mathematics known as transfinite arithmetic that is still thriving, and that work is nowadays recognised as work of genius. Now, suppose you want to know whether two sets or two collections are the same size. You can sometimes tell that they are by counting their members. For example, if you're in a room with a number of other people, then you may be in a position to tell by counting that there are as many men in the room as there are women, that the set of men in the room is the same size as the set of women there. But you can also sometimes tell that two sets are the same size without counting. Mary Lang again.
So if I have a bunch of cats and a bunch of dogs and I want to know whether there's as many cats as dogs or not, what I could do is line up one cat with one dog, another cat with another dog, and once I've paired them up like that, if there's none left over, the two sets are the same size. If there's some cats left over, there's more cats, and if there's some dogs left over, there's more dogs.
Similarly, you know without counting, indeed without being able to count, that the set of firstborn twins that have ever lived is the same size as the set of second-born twins that have ever lived, for they too can obviously be paired off. Now, does this principle extend to infinite sets? Yes, why not, said Cantor. But this is where it starts to get a little weird. For now, we seem forced to say that the set of counting numbers that we considered earlier, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., is the same size as the set of even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, etc., even though the first of these sets includes everything in the second, plus all the odd numbers as well. Here's Mary Lang again.
If we want to show that there's as many counting numbers as there are even numbers, all we need to do is find some way of pairing the two collections off with each other. So, in other words, for every counting number, we need to match it with some even number, and for every even number, we need to match it with some counting number and have none left over on either side at the end. And there's actually an easy way of doing this, right? So if you start with the counting numbers 1, 2, 3, and so on, you can match each counting number with its double, just double every one of them. So 1 gets matched to 2, 2 gets matched to 4, 3 gets matched to 6, 4 gets matched to 8, and so on and so on and so on. We can see pretty clearly from that every counting number will be matched to an even number, and every even number will be matched to a counting number. So there's not going to be anything left out through doing that matching, and that means mathematically we can say those two sets are the same size as each other. There's as many counting numbers as there are even numbers.
It's tempting to conclude that comparisons of size just don't make sense in the infinite case. But this wasn't Cantor's reaction. He accepted that the infinite sets in question are the same size. And that's curious enough. The idea that two sets are the same size, even though one of them contains everything in the other, plus more besides. But it's not ultra curious. After all, perhaps we can use these methods to show that all infinite sets are the same size, which wouldn't be all that counterintuitive. But no, Cantor's remarkable discovery, and this is where it really does get ultra-curious, is that some infinite sets are bigger than others. A pairing of the sort that we've just considered is not always available. To begin to see why, let's return to the subsets of a given set.
So if we take the example of the set of the Beatles, John, Paul, George and Ringo, then a subset of that set is just some bunch of those members taken together. So we can think of what subsets there are of that set. There's the four of them taken together, that set. There's the various sets of three of them taken together. So you've got all the sets of trios that you could have out of the Beatles. So John, Paul and George working together, or John, Paul and Ringo working together, or Paul, George and Ringo working together. And then you can do the same for the pairs of those. So there's John and Paul, Paul and Ringo, George and Ringo, and so on. Then there's all the solo acts, all the sets of just one of them there, John on his own, Paul on his own, and so on. And finally, there's the empty subset of that set, the set that contains none of them. So if none of them are working at all, then that's a subset of the Beatles too. It's just the sad empty subset on its own. And if you counted all those up, so from the original four-membered set that we had, you will find there's going to be 16 subsets of that.
So there are more subsets of the Beatles than there are individual Beatles. There's 4 Beatles, but there are 16 sets of Beatles, and subsets of Beatles. Do these ideas extend to the infinite? And it turns out that they do. Cantor's most important discovery was that even if you start off with an infinite set, still it's going to be true that it has more subsets than it has individual members. Let's take an example. Mary Lang again.
So let's look then at an infinite set, the set of the counting numbers 1, 2, 3 and so on. Again, it's going to have subsets. The subsets are just those sets whose members are all counting numbers. So the set of the even numbers is a subset of the set of counting numbers. The set of odd numbers is a subset of the counting numbers. The set of all my favourite numbers is a subset of the set of counting numbers. And for any arbitrary combination of numbers, you can make that into a subset, which will be a subset of the set of counting numbers.
What Cantor showed was that you can never pair all those subsets with individual counting numbers. If you try, if you pair 1 with one subset, and 2 with another, and 3 with another, and so on, there will always be a subset left over. Why is this? Well, some numbers will themselves be members of whatever subset they're paired with, others won't. And it's the set of those that won't that must be left over. If you think it's paired with a number, try working out whether the number it's paired with belongs to it or not. Trust me, you've got a long night ahead of you. And a forlorn one too. The upshot of all of this is that there are different infinite sizes. Some infinities are bigger than others. And not only that, we can measure these sizes and calculate with the different infinite numbers involved. Now, Cantor's work polarised opinion in his own lifetime, and it has continued to polarise opinion ever since. His near contemporary, the German mathematician David Hilbert, said,
"No one shall be able to drive us from the paradise that Cantor has created for us."
The 20th century German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein replied,
"I wouldn't dream of trying to drive anyone from this paradise. I would do something quite different. I would try to show you that it is not a paradise, so that you'll leave of your own accord."
As pure mathematics, Cantor's work is more or less unassailable. The controversy concerns its significance. While there's no denying the mathematical craftsmanship of Cantor's theory, with its array of different infinite numbers, many people would deny that it has any interest or relevance beyond mathematics. Whatever the correct assessment of Cantor's work, it certainly made its mark. It did so not least by creating as many problems as it solved, as we'll see in the next programme. The 19th century German mathematician Georg Cantor devised a formal mathematical theory of the infinite, and it was a work of genius. We glimpsed some of the main ideas behind this theory in the last programme, but it took its toll. Cantor eventually died in an asylum, and his work led to a period in the history of mathematics of unprecedented crisis and uncertainty. By subjecting the infinite to formal scrutiny, mathematicians ended up confronting puzzles at the very heart of their discipline, puzzles that indicate some basic limits of human knowledge. Cantor proved that some infinities are bigger than others. In particular, he proved that there are always more sets of things of any given kind than there are individual things of that kind, even when there are infinitely many of both. Here is Marcus Jaquinto, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at University College London.
For example, he proved that there are more sets of people than there are people, more sets of apples than there are apples, more sets of widgets than there are widgets, and so on.
And so on. There's the rub. For what about sets of sets? How can there be more of those than there are sets? For how can there be more sets of anything than there are sets? Well, at this point your head may begin to reel. You may wonder what a set of sets even is. But why shouldn't there be such a thing? We have the set of green apples, whose members are all those apples that are green. Why shouldn't we have the set of 7-membered sets, whose members are all those sets that have 7 members, such as the days of the week, the colours of the rainbow, or the dwarves that befriended Snow White? The 20th century British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, trying to wrestle with these ideas, eventually stumbled across what has come to be known as Russell's paradox. Once we've acknowledged that there are sets of sets, he said, we can distinguish between sets that belong to themselves and sets that don't. The set of apples doesn't. It's not an apple. The set of things mentioned in this programme does. I've just mentioned it. The paradox concerns the set of sets that don't belong to themselves, as Marcus Jaquinto explains.
There ought to be such a set, but it turns out to be impossible that there is such a set, for much the same reason that there cannot be a nun who prays for all the nuns in her convent who do not pray for themselves. Think of it like this. If there is such a nun, she obeys this rule that she prays for all and only those nuns in her convent who do not pray for themselves. She goes through the list of nuns in her convent until she comes to her own name, and she says, well, do I pray for myself or not? If I do pray for myself, then, by my rule, I shouldn't pray for myself.
And this is because her rule is that she should not pray for somebody who's already praying for herself.
Right. Exactly
Okay.
right. So then she thinks, well, I shouldn't pray for myself. But if she does not pray for herself, then by her rule, she's one of those nuns for whom she ought to pray.
Because the rule tells her that she's got to pray for all the nuns that don't pray for themselves.
Exactly. So if you put those two things together, she's going to pray for herself if and only if she does not pray for herself.
Which is impossible.
Which is impossible.
She's in a bind.
She's in a bind, yes. There can't be such a nun.
This may all seem abstruse and esoteric, You might wonder what relevance this poor nun has to the mathematics of the infinite, or indeed to any serious mathematics. But Russell's paradox, when it was first discovered, seemed to indicate a crisis in the very foundations of mathematics, where the concept of a set plays a pivotal role. Russell communicated his paradox to Gottlob Frege, a German logician and mathematician who had been trying to make these foundations more secure. The first volume of Frege's masterwork, in which he pursued this project, had just been published, and Frege was busy writing the third. The second was already in press. And although Frege's achievements were immense, he'd been quite oblivious to Russell's problem, which seriously afflicted what he'd been trying to do. In fact, it seemed to put paid to his entire project. He was devastated, though in his reply to Russell, he managed to hide his devastation.
Your discovery of the contradiction in my system has surprised me beyond words, and I should almost like to say left me thunderstruck, because it has rocked the ground on which I'd meant to build arithmetic. The second volume of my work is to appear shortly. I shall have to give it an appendix where I do justice to your discovery. If only I could find the right way of looking at it.
Russell was astounded by Frege's reaction. He later wrote,
"There is nothing in my knowledge to compare with Frege's dedication to truth. His entire life's work was on the verge of completion. His second volume was about to be published, and upon finding that his fundamental assumption was in error, he responded with intellectual pleasure, clearly submerging any feelings of personal disappointment. It was almost superhuman, and a telling indication of that of which men are capable if their dedication is to creative work and knowledge, instead of cruder efforts to dominate and be known."
Nevertheless, Frege died embittered. Despite his own and other people's efforts to get round Russell's paradox, his life's work seemed to have been a failure. Cantor, meanwhile, had been struggling with a problem of his own. Given that there are different infinite sizes, and given, in particular, that the set of counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., is smaller than the set of sets of counting numbers, the question arises how much smaller. Cantor's own hypothesis was that it's just one size smaller. In other words, that there are no sets of intermediate size. But he never succeeded in confirming this hypothesis, nor indeed in refuting it. He agonized long and hard over the question, alternately thinking that he had established one answer, then thinking that he had established the other. This did much to compound his lifelong depression and despair concerning his own work. His question was famously listed by the German mathematician David Hilbert at the beginning of the 20th century as one of the 23 most significant unanswered mathematical questions to be addressed in the ensuing century, and it remains unanswered to this day. However, just to say this would be seriously misleading. The suggestion would be that mathematicians simply haven't been assiduous enough, that if only they applied more effort, they might be able to settle the issue. But in fact, it's been shown that using all the currently accepted basic principles of mathematics, it's impossible to settle the issue. Marcus Jaquinto again.
So it looks as though we're stuck with an unanswerable question. It's not, in principle, absolutely unanswerable because we could find a new basic principle to add to our current stock of basic principles, which would settle the question. But in fact, after decades of searching for a new basic principle which commanded assent that was basically credible, none was found. So it looks increasingly likely that this is a question which, if it has an answer at all, is one that is going to be beyond us to supply. And that means that we've stumbled upon an inherent limitation of mathematical knowledge.
The young 20th century German logician Kurt Gödel showed that this kind of limitation was, in a sense, unavoidable. For he showed that no matter what basic principles of mathematics we accept, provided that there are only finitely many of them, there will always be mathematical truths that are beyond the range of those principles, and hence mathematical questions that we can't use them to answer. This may sound like a depressing conclusion, but by no means all philosophers have seen it that way. Some have seen grounds for hope, arguing that we can always come up with new basic principles to get round such limitations, and indeed that our very ability to do this indicates that we, human beings, have a kind of creativity that can never be matched by even the most sophisticated computer. The debate about whether Gödel's result is fundamentally unsettling or fundamentally elevating continues to rage. Let's return to the foundations of mathematics and their security, or insecurity. Russell's paradox about the set of sets that don't belong to themselves had revealed an inconsistency in the basic principles that mathematicians had been working with up to then.
The preeminent mathematician of the time, David Hilbert, asked this question: how do we know that there isn't an inconsistency generated by another source elsewhere in our mathematics? And David Hilbert produced a brilliant, completely novel idea for trying to answer this question. In short, his idea was to set out the basic principles of mathematics, in particular the basic principles of Cantor's theory of infinite sets, as a completely precise symbolic system, starting with just a finite stock of very precise principles, and then prove, using the most secure methods, that no inconsistency is derivable from that symbolic system.
This was known as Hilbert's program. The problem for Hilbert was that the limitations in mathematics that we were considering earlier, i.e. the limitations established by Gödel, seemed, among other things, to threaten this very program. Does this mean that contemporary mathematics is left languishing in a state of irremediable crisis and uncertainty? Marcus Jaquinto sees room for optimism.
If you ask me what the situation is now, some 80 years after all that happened, I would say there isn't a crisis in the foundations of mathematics any longer. The ambiguities and the unclarities of 19th century mathematics don't bother modern mathematics. Moreover, no new inconsistencies in mathematics have been found since the paradoxes of the late 19th century and very early 20th century. Moreover, modified versions of Hilbert's program have enabled us to prove beyond doubt the consistency of a surprisingly large amount of advanced mathematics. So you could sum up the situation by saying, although we can't be totally certain of the reliability and consistency of all mathematics, we can be certain of the consistency of a very large part of it, and we can be confident in the reliability and consistency of all of it.
The fact remains that formal mathematical work on the infinite, despite the remarkable advances in knowledge that it has delivered, has also left us acutely aware of what we do not know, indeed of what we cannot know. Like so many others in this history, Cantor, in trying to make sense of the infinite, ended up drawing attention to some of our own inherent finite limitations. On a clear, moonless night, a faint patch can be seen in the constellation Andromeda. This is the Andromeda Nebula. It's a galaxy of about 100,000 million stars. It's the furthest object visible to the naked eye. Its light, travelling fast enough to circumnavigate the Earth more than 7 times in 1 second, takes 2 million years to reach us. Yet by comparison with other galaxies, it's a close neighbour. The distances are absolutely mind-numbing. Even so, they're still only finite. And that brings us to the central question of this programme. Where, if at all, does the concept of infinity have application to physical reality? For many of us, nothing is more evocative of the infinite than looking up at the night sky. But how appropriate is this? Is the number of stars infinite? Is space infinite? Is anything in nature infinite? Ever since the time of the ancient Greeks, philosophers and scientists have pondered these questions. In the 4th century BC, Archytas, a friend of Plato, advanced a very primitive and very natural argument that the universe is spatially infinite.
If I am at the extremity of the heaven of the fixed stars, can I stretch outward my hand or staff? It is absurd to suppose that I could not. And if I can, what is outside must be either body or space. We may then in the same way get to the outside of that again, and so on. And if there is always a new place to which the staff may be held out, this clearly involves extension without limit.
Aristotle, writing a little later, resisted Archytas's argument. According to Aristotle, although it's true that the universe can't be bounded by anything outside it, nevertheless, it's only spatially finite. Now, this is a very difficult idea for us to grasp, but we'd better not dismiss it out of hand. As we shall see, it's an idea that has become a staple of contemporary cosmology. How then do we arbitrate between Archytas and Aristotle? The English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, didn't think that there was anything to arbitrate on. Neither the view that the universe is infinite, nor the view that the universe is finite, has any grounding in what we can observe, so neither view has any meaning.
When it is asked if the world is finite or infinite, there is nothing in the mind corresponding to the term world.
Many people still think in this way. John Barrow, Professor of Mathematical Sciences at Cambridge University, distinguishes between questions about the age and size of the entire universe, which are at best matters of idle speculation, at worst meaningless, and genuinely scientific questions about what we can observe.
If you ask the question, is the universe infinitely old? Did it have a beginning? The answer today is that, well, our little piece of the universe, the visible part, did have a beginning, but whether the entire universe, which may be infinite in extent, had a beginning, there's no reason why it should. So we've come to appreciate the fact that although the universe is potentially infinite in size, we can only ever see a finite part of it. And we've got to distinguish between our observable universe, or the visible universe, and the entire universe. And so when you hear someone saying, well, I think the universe is infinite, or the universe is finite, if they're talking about the entire universe, this is a philosophical statement. It can never be confirmed.
But suppose we confine attention to just that part of the universe on which empirical evidence can be brought to bear. Can't we legitimately ask whether this is infinite or finite, even if neither alternative is directly observable? The great English scientist Isaac Newton certainly thought so. He argued in the 17th century that the matter in the universe must be infinite, on the grounds that if it were finite, and if, as he also thought, matter beyond the solar system was stable, then it couldn't maintain itself in gravitational equilibrium, and so couldn't avoid collapsing into its centre.
It seems to me that if all the matter in the universe were evenly scattered throughout all the heavens, and the whole space throughout which this matter was scattered was finite, the matter on the outside of this space would by its gravity tend towards all the matter on the inside, and by consequence fall down into the middle of the whole space, and there compose one great spherical mass.
Nevertheless, the broad consensus today is that the matter in the universe is only finite. and indeed that space itself is only finite, albeit unbounded, just as Aristotle thought. This is the idea that I said earlier is very difficult for us to grasp. How can space be both finite and unbounded? Joe Dunkley, Professor of Astrophysics at Oxford University, gives one way of understanding this.
One idea for what space could be like is something a bit like the surface of the Earth itself. Okay, so if you imagine you're an ant crawling around the surface of the Earth, or even a person walking around the surface of the Earth, there's no edge to that. You can go off in any direction you like, and you'll end up coming back to where you started. You can walk all the way around the surface of the Earth, and you return back home, if you can cross the oceans. And so that surface, we would say, of the Earth is finite but unbounded. It doesn't go on forever. It's not infinite in size, but there isn't an edge to it. There isn't a beginning and there isn't an end. And it's possible that space itself, that could also be curved like the surface of the Earth, so that you could go off in one direction out in space and eventually come back to where you started.
But if space were curved like the surface of the Earth, how would that manifest itself?
Actually, when we think about it as physicists or mathematicians, one of the ways we work out if something is curved is we actually can draw a triangle on it. And we see what the angles add up to. A normal triangle that you draw on a flat piece of paper, the angles add up to 180 degrees. But if you try drawing a triangle on an orange, the angles add up to more than that.
And do we find that when we measure the angles in triangles, those angles add up to something other than 180 degrees?
Now, it's possible, and actually our current data are more in favour of it, that space itself is not curved, that space itself is more like a flat piece of paper. If you drew a triangle in space, the angles would add up to the normal amount, 180 degrees.
It's worth mentioning that the triangles under investigation here are pretty big. They have to be, otherwise any difference from 180 degrees due to the curvature of space wouldn't show up. So it wouldn't be good enough to investigate triangles that can fit on a sheet of A4. They've got to be considerably bigger than that.
We're talking about billions of light years, where a light year is the distance light can travel in a whole year, and light goes incredibly fast. So when we're thinking about the behaviour of space, we're talking about things on enormous scales, much bigger than the size of our solar system, because we wouldn't be able to figure out things like, is space infinite or finite, or is it curved like an orange or flat like a piece of paper? We couldn't do that just from our solar system.
The current evidence seems to tell in favour of flat space then, not curved space. Even so, it's still possible that space is finite. Indeed, it's not only possible that space is finite, it's possible that space is expanding over time. And many cosmologists believe that that's precisely what it is doing. This is in part because there's evidence that distant galaxies are moving away from us. What form does this evidence take? Well, it's a bit like the evidence you'd have that an ambulance was moving away from you if you could only hear its siren. The siren gets fainter and fainter, of course, but it also appears to have a lower and lower pitch. This is an effect due to the way in which the movement of the ambulance affects the length of the sound waves emanating from it. There's a similar effect in the case of the galaxies. What's more, we can use the same evidence to extrapolate backwards. Just as we can conclude that the galaxies will get further and further apart in the future, so too we can conclude that they were closer and closer together in the past, right back to a point where absolutely everything was concentrated in one spot, and a gigantic cosmic explosion gave rise to the universe as we know it today. A finitely big universe, which began at a particular point in time finitely long ago, this might be thought to be music to the ears of most scientists. For on the whole, scientists like to evade the infinite, as John Barrow explains.
In most areas of science and engineering, if an infinity pops up in an equation or you predict that something is infinite, the immediate reaction of the scientist is, oh, we've got to work harder, we've got a bad model here. We need to introduce more realism in our equations. And so there was always a general feeling that when infinities pop up, it's a sign that your theory is incomplete. It hasn't got the whole story included in the equations.
In fact, however, that point, finitely long ago when everything began, doesn't abolish the infinite. It reintroduces it.
If you trace the expansion of the universe backwards, it always suggested that there was an apparent beginning at a finite time in the past. And this became known as the Big Bang. And if that was a real event in our past, then there would be an infinite density, an infinite temperature. And in some pictures of the universe, that we know that if the universe were not expanding fast enough today, it might eventually be overwhelmed by the gravitational attraction of all its contents, and its expansion would be reversed into contraction, and there would be a big crunch of infinite density in the future.
Ooh, but not to worry. We shall all long since have departed by then. On a more theoretical level, however, this is concerning. For, as we've noted, scientists are troubled by that kind of infinity. As John Barrow emphasises,
once you have an infinity, you can't predict. If you have an infinite density or an infinite physical quantity somewhere, then on the other side of it, anything can happen to the future. So there's a breakdown of predictability.
At the beginning of this series, we saw that ancient Greek thinkers could neither fully make sense of the infinite, nor simply ignore it. 2,500 years later, we find ourselves in a similar position. Exploration of the cosmos invites us to reckon with the infinite at points where we're not sure what reckoning with the infinite even is. We're listening to a scene from an opera by the Czech composer Janacek, called the Macropolis Case. The opera has a simple but fascinating premise. 300 years before the action takes place, its heroine, Alina Macropolis, has been given an elixir of life by her father, the court physician. She's now nearly 350 years old. But she's reached a state of utter indifference towards everything. Her life has lost all meaning. In the excerpt that we just heard, it is Macropolis herself who is singing, and this is her lament.
Dying or living, it's all one. It's all the same thing. In me, life has come to a standstill. I cannot go on. In the end, it's the same. Singing and silence.
Macropolis refuses to take the elixir again and dies. Janacek's opera raises some profound questions about life, about death, about purpose, and about our very finitude, or finite nature. It's an undeniable fact about us humans that we are finite. But how should we understand that fact? And what attitude should we have towards it? This will take us to the very heart of what most concerns us about the infinite, how we relate to it, and what this tells us about ourselves. Human finitude has many facets. We're part of a reality that is, for the most part, quite independent of us. We're limited in what we can know, We're limited in what we can do, but most obviously of all, we have spatial and temporal limits. Not that it's entirely straightforward what these spatial and temporal limits are. For instance, did I begin to exist on the day that I was born, or had I already existed for some time before then as a fetus? How big am I? The intuitive answer is that I'm about 1 3/4 meters tall, weighing about 140 pounds. But how much of that is really part of me? You can certainly cut my hair off without destroying me. You can even amputate both my legs without destroying me. There are some philosophers who conclude that I'm only about 7 centimetres tall, weighing about 3 pounds, greyish, the consistency of extremely thick yoghurt, and housed inside a skull. Others go further still and conclude that I'm not really a physical entity at all. But whatever we should say about such questions, human beings are certainly not infinitely big. And unless there's an afterlife of some sort, there will come a time when we no longer exist. How should we view that prospect? Is the prospect of our eventual and complete annihilation one to fear? Is it one to deplore? Does it threaten our life with meaninglessness? The Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived in the 4th century BC, and his followers, the Epicureans, did not believe in an afterlife. But neither did they believe that there's anything to fear or to deplore about being dead. They didn't see why we should be averse to what we won't be around to witness. Sophie Chappell, Professor of Philosophy at the Open University, elaborates their argument.
The Epicurean argument rests on a kind of inversion of Woody Allen's famous joke, "I'm not afraid of death, I just don't want to be there when it happens." The Epicureans, and specifically Epicurus himself, were of the view that death is not an evil to us, because at the time that death happens to us, we're not there to experience it. The Epicureans thought that the only things that can be evils to us are things that we experience, and so death couldn't be an evil to us.
250 years later, the Roman philosopher Lucretius, himself an Epicurean, reinforced the point by reminding us that we don't have negative feelings about the fact that we didn't exist before we were born, and the fact that we won't exist after we're dead, if it is a fact, is nothing but a mirror image of that.
Look back again to see how the ending expanse of past time, before we were born, has been nothing to us. For nature holds this forth to us as a mirror image of the time to come after our death. Is there anything terrible there? Does anything seem gloomy? Is it not more peaceful than any sleep?
Much more recently, the 20th century British philosopher Bernard Williams went even further. He didn't just dwell on the innocuousness of being dead, he dwelt on the awfulness of being perpetually alive. He wrote a famous article about this that took both its title and its inspiration from the Macropolis case, the Janacek opera with which we began. The article's subtitle was equally revealing.
Reflections on the Tedium of Immortality.
Williams argued that a never-ending life would eventually become just what Alina Macropolis's life had become, tedious to the point of unendurability. Sophie Chappell again.
For Williams, the question is a question about whether something could be, at the same time, your life and also worth living for eternity. And the problem is that to be worth living for eternity, it looks like you're going to have to go on and on, either finding new things to do or finding new ways of being satisfied in doing the same things again and again. And that's a problem because it's only, according to Williams, if you go on doing the same things, if you go on having the same commitments, if you go on being at least close to the person that you started the process as, that you can talk about it as your life. So the dilemma is, can it go on being your life and yet be endurable for eternity? And Williams thinks the answer to that is no.
What are we to make of Williams's argument?
I disagree with Williams myself about this because, in the first place, I'm not so sure that we can't go on and on finding more and more indefinitely different good things to do with our lives. It seems to me there's a very wide diversity of ways in which we can find something worthwhile to do. But in any case, I'm not as clear as Williams seems to be that it's so very important that we remain the same person. If you consider the rather well-known example of the caterpillar that turns into a butterfly, or the seed that turns into a plant, well, in a sense, the caterpillar's future is the butterfly, and the seed's future is the plant. And in a sense, it isn't, because they're not quite the same thing. Maybe it's like that with us.
Williams's aversion to immortality doesn't command universal assent, then. For some philosophers, it's just straightforwardly obvious that annihilation, followed by complete nothingness, is a very great and uncompensated evil. Thomas Nagel, a popular 20th century American philosopher who's still alive, is another who finds himself on the opposite side of this divide from Williams. He writes that given the choice between living for another week and dying in 5 minutes, he would always choose to live for another week, at least if all else were equal. That is, at least if there weren't some other even worse catastrophe that his death could avert. And he treats this as tantamount to saying that he would be glad to live forever.
I believe that there is little to be said for death. It is a great curse, and if we truly face it, nothing can make it palatable, except the knowledge that by dying we can prevent an even greater evil. Otherwise, given the simple choice between living for another week and dying in 5 minutes, I would always choose to live for another week. I conclude that I would be glad to live forever.
This divide between philosophers such as Williams, who thinks that mortality is preferable to immortality, and philosophers such as Nagel, for whom it's the other way round, may be as much a temperamental divide as an intellectual one. Nagel himself, in a footnote to his discussion, asks,
"Can it be that Williams is more easily bored than I?"
I think it can. But it's also worth noting that insofar as what Nagel is offering is an argument, as opposed to just a declaration of his own preference, then it's an argument that can be challenged. Suppose that given a choice between living for another week and dying in 5 minutes, I would always choose to live for another week. Then my weekly choices would certainly keep me alive forever. But this is not tantamount to saying that I would be glad to live forever. I might have a clear preference not to live forever. Indeed, I might be appalled at the prospect of living forever, yet still never want these to be my last 5 minutes. Where does this leave us? Some philosophers celebrate our finite nature. Others lament it. But there does seem to be consensus on one point. Our finite nature doesn't by itself deprive our life of meaning. Indeed, those who celebrate it typically do so because it helps to confer such meaning, while those who lament it typically do so because it threatens, in the fullness of time, to take that meaning away. Perhaps what this shows is that, despite our finitude, indeed because of our finitude, we are able in some sense to reach out and touch the infinite. This is something that the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes believed. Here is John Cottingham, Professor Emeritus at Reading University.
I think Descartes and others were onto something interesting, that there's something about us, although we are obviously animals, we are obviously biological creatures, limited in many ways, but there's something about us that seems to reach beyond that. We have, if you like, transcendent urges or aspirations. There's a certain restlessness in humanity. If you give a horse a nice field and plenty of exercise and fresh air and food, end of story. It's a fulfilled, happy creature. If you give a human being maximally comfortable conditions, even if you give it interesting activities to perform, that isn't the end of the story. There's something in us that always reaches out for more. There's what St. Augustine called the restlessness of the human heart.
And, says John Cottingham, our very sense of our own finitude fuels these aspirations for more.
We do have these aspirations towards something greater, something more perfect than we are. Indeed, even in recognizing our own imperfections, we already perhaps have an implicit sense of something we fall short of, which we aspire to.
That's a very good cue for the next and final programme in this series, where we shall explore further how self-consciousness about our own limitations gives the great questions of the infinite their urgency. We began this series with a quotation from the 20th century German mathematician David Hilbert. Let's hear it again.
The infinite has always stirred the emotions of mankind more deeply than any other question. The infinite has stimulated and fertilized reason as few other ideas have, but also the infinite more than any other notion is in need of clarification.
What we've seen since then has borne ample witness to Hilbert's claim. Generations of thinkers have pondered the limitlessness of space and time, the endlessness of numbers, and the perfection of God. And they found themselves captivated and enthralled by the infinite. But many, aware that the infinite is fraught with paradox and mystery, have been disturbed by it and wary of it. At the root of both our fascination with the infinite and our unease about it, indeed, at the root of our very sense of it, is our awareness that we ourselves are finite. It's not just that we're tiny and ephemeral, there's something more fundamental than that. We find ourselves limited and constrained by what is utterly independent of us. Things literally get in our way. And that gives us a contrasting sense of what's unlimited, unconstrained, and self-sufficient. If scientific investigation should eventually show that space and time themselves are finite, still we'd have this sense of the infinite. But it's a sense of something that eludes us. It's a sense, we might almost say, of something that we can't have any sense of. So we're unsure what to make of the infinite, and that means that we're unsure what to make of ourselves. Where does all of this leave us? Like the Greeks 2,500 years ago, we find ourselves on the one hand troubled by the infinite, but on the other hand unable to ignore it. 4 centuries ago, the French philosopher René Descartes took issue with the idea that we begin with the finite and then just think of the infinite as the opposite of it. On the contrary, he said, we begin with the infinite and then just think of the finite as the opposite of that. And this led him to argue that there must be something in reality, something infinite, from which we get the very idea. He had in mind God, but there's a non-theological version of his argument that survived into contemporary philosophy. Here's what the influential American philosopher Thomas Nagel writes about the idea of infinity in connection with numbers.
To get the idea of infinity, we must understand that the numbers we use to count things are merely the first part of a series that never ends. Though our direct acquaintance with specific numbers is extremely limited, we cannot make sense of it except by putting them and ourselves in the context of something larger, something whose existence is independent of our fragmentary experience of it. When we think about the finite activity of counting, we come to realize that it can only be understood as part of something infinite.
that's not the only variation on Descartes' theme in Nagel. There are other ways too in which Nagel thinks that our finite capacities point beyond themselves to something much grander. Here is John Cottingham, Professor Emeritus at Reading University.
Although he's a materialist, or at least he certainly rejects anything like traditional belief in God, he nonetheless thinks it striking that somehow we've evolved in a complex way in such a way that we have a grasp of very powerful objective truths, the truths of logic and mathematics, for example, and also certain objective truths of morality. And this means, according to Nagel, that our minds are what he calls instruments of transcendence. They somehow, although we are finite biological creatures, they somehow reach out to grasp these objective truths. And that's a remarkable fact about us, which Nagel thinks can't be fully explained just by the random processes of biological mutation and natural selection.
Even an atheist such as Nagel, then, thinks that we're in touch with something transcendent. But wait, our topic is the infinite. What exactly does the infinite have to do with the transcendent? Perhaps these are two quite different ideas. Perhaps the infinite isn't anything grand at all. Perhaps it's much closer to home than we've been assuming. After all, it might well be argued, and as we've seen in previous programmes it has been argued, that every time you move from A to B, you do infinitely many things. You move first to the midpoint, then to the 3/4 point, then to the 7/8 point, and so on. It was in this vein that the 20th century German philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein tried to take some of the mystique out of the infinite. We naturally think that the infinite, if it exists at all, must be something awesome and utterly beyond our comprehension. But really, in Wittgenstein's view, to understand the infinite, we simply need to reflect on how we use phrases like "and so on." Simple phrases whose use is governed by simple grammatical rules that finite beings like us can easily grasp. Here's what Wittgenstein himself says.
The expression "and so on" is nothing but the expression "and so on." Nothing, that is, but a sign, which can't do more than have meaning via the rules that hold of it.
If we take such debunking seriously, it allows us to separate completely the idea of the infinite from the idea of the transcendent. It allows us to treat the infinite as something quite tame and unremarkable. So where does this leave us? Whether or not we side with Wittgenstein and admit that there's nothing to the infinite beyond our finite linguistic resources and the rules governing their use, we must acknowledge our urge to think that there is more to the infinite than that. We must acknowledge our urge to believe in what might be called the infinite with a capital I, the unconditioned, self-sufficient, and transcendent. Where does this urge come from? How does it manifest itself? John Cottingham again.
Well, there are three categories, I think, in our awareness of the beauties of the natural world, which seem to have something in them which isn't just a mere ability to produce pleasure in us, but some special quality, what's sometimes been called a sacred aspect, or a numinous even aspect. Another area is the requirements of morality, which I recognize as incumbent on me to observe, even though I may not want to, even though my desires may be to turn away. I nonetheless recognize their force. And a third area is what used to be called the eternal truths of logic and mathematics, which I recognize as necessary universal, and unalterable. So in all these areas, I seem to recognize something that transcends, that goes beyond the ordinary contingent flux of biological and physical circumstances. And in so far as I can recognize those areas, I seem to be reaching forward to what you could call a dimension of the transcendent.
We have a sense of the transcendent then, and we have a sense of the infinite with a capital I. This is something akin to a religious experience or an experience of the sacred. It suggests something infinitely greater than us that may give meaning to our lives. But how might such experiences be located in a secular worldview?
You could just say, well, these are weird, funny, subjective states that we get into, which perhaps we could induce by psychedelic drugs or by fasting. So that would be a kind of reductionist or deflationary account of the sacred. If you don't want to go that route, then you have to say, I suppose, that there's something about reality that calls forth these experiences. In other words, they're not just a private trip or drug-induced fit, but they are a response to something real.
Which brings us right back to Descartes, back to the idea that the best explanation for these powerful responses may be that they're responses to something that's genuinely infinite with a capital I. But Descartes hasn't won the argument just yet. There's another quite different approach that we can take. For a striking example of this alternative approach, we can turn to the 20th century British philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch. Where Descartes had said that our idea of God was an idea of something so great that only something that great could have implanted it in us, Murdoch said that, on the contrary, our idea of God was an idea of something so great that nothing in reality could ever match up to it. God, she said, does not exist and cannot exist, because God is too great for mere existence. Of course, the question where we get our idea of God from then comes back to the fore. In fact, if anything, it becomes all the more pressing. Certainly, in Murdoch's view, our idea of God demands attention and respect. Here's how she puts it.
No existing thing could be what we have meant by God. Any existing God would be less than God. God does not and cannot exist. But what led us to conceive of him does exist and is constantly experienced and pictured, incarnate in work and knowledge and love.
Whatever our view of this matter, it helps to show that in trying to make sense of the infinite, we're also trying to make sense of ourselves. We're trying to make sense of our own experiences and our own limitations, and what these tell us about our place in the world. Throughout this series, we've looked at the infinite in philosophical terms, in theological terms, in mathematical terms, and in scientific terms. We've drawn distinctions, made connections, performed calculations, and looked up at the stars. But always, in the background, there has been our own finite nature, our own finitude. Always the question has come back to how we, in our finitude, relate to what surpasses that finitude. However the history of the infinite develops, it is sure to be, as it has always been, a vital part of our own history.
This is the BBC.